Joseph is professor at the University of Verne at the Sociology Anthropology department. And I found out about him when I Googled or when I had a look at YouTube for social capital, and he gave a very nice talk about the dependence of social capital and how to build cities or the infrastructure in neighborhoods. And today, Joseph is giving us a presentation about the structure of social capital. And I think he wrote a paper about network structures on campus and which resources students can mobilize in the social networks. I hope I summarized this correctly. Otherwise, Joseph, please correct me. And I think the floor is yours. Perhaps you can also say some words about you. And thank you so much for giving us this webinar. This is great. And I think the relatively high number of people who registered shows that you have a very interesting topic.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate you inviting me to this interesting group. How long has the group been around, this Social Capital Research Group?
Yes, you're very right. I should have said some words about our group too. I think the group was created by Tristan perhaps 1 year ago. And now we are, I think today we reached 530 members. So we are growing steadily and in the last times a bit faster. And I think we started the webinar series perhaps in October. So now we have every 2 weeks, we have a webinar, and we try to have webinars in the morning at 6 a.m. UTC and in the evening at 6 p.m. UTC. So for every time zone, there's an opportunity, because now for such an opportunity, people have to get up at 4 a.m. like Fleur, and which shows her interest. And we have people, I think, from all over the world. We have people from New Zealand, we have people from Australia, I'm from Germany. I think we have people from Croatia, we have people from USA. So we are a very international group, and we are a mix out of people who try to do their PhD and people who already did their PhD. So it's graduate and postgraduate students.
Okay. Well, for those of you that are on at 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. in the morning, I really appreciate you coming out, and definitely keep me apprised of what's going on, because I'd love to come and listen to some of the talks that you guys do throughout the year. That'd be great. So I am, just a little bit about me. I don't want to spend too much time on me, but I'm an associate professor at the University of Verne, and I study social capital. I look at sort of factors that facilitate social capital, and then also how social capital plays out in group settings. My most recent research is actually looking at social capital within dorms or residence halls within the university that I work at. It's kind of a little bit easier data to access, so I've been switching to that from some of the stuff that I did on communities, although I still am very interested in social capital within communities, and I do have some studies that I'll be looking at in the near future on communities. So that's just a little bit about me. I mostly focus on sociology, but I do incorporate a little bit of criminology. I have a colleague that I've been working on some stuff with mass shootings and how actually social capital can act as a buffer in communities to prevent mass shootings from happening. So that's been something we've been working on for the last year or so, but I'm not going to talk about that research today. Let's see here. Okay, so I'm going to go over a couple of studies that I've done. One of them is a study that I did. Actually, a lot of this work came out of dissertation data that I collected. And so those of you that are going through dissertation programs know that that data that you're collecting can have many, many useful lives as you go through your career. So I've definitely used that data for a lot of different studies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the most interesting things that came out of that work. And then I'm going to talk to you about some of the stuff that I'm doing more recently with the residence halls and some of the sort of elements of social capital, and looking at how structure can, or how social capital can be predicted by the structure of a network. So I've been kind of trying to understand that. that's actually very interesting work, but it's also challenging. And so that's still work that it's ongoing, and I'm still trying to come up with ideas. So definitely any suggestions you have about that work would be awesome. Okay, so in terms of the first study, this is a study that I did, mid 2000s, and I was looking at whether or not the built environment, and specifically I was looking at new urbanist design, which I know you guys have a lot of that in Europe. Those of you that are in Europe, and we've got some of them in the United States as well. So I was trying to understand whether or not some of these design features in the built environment that are related to new urbanism, which is what NUS stands for, New Urbanist Subdivision, and SSS stands for Standard Suburban Subdivision, which is sort of the subdivisions you see in the United States where it's all residential, there's no businesses or mixed use anywhere, and oftentimes blocks are disconnected from one another. They're not really designed for walking, they're more automobile centric. So I was comparing this new urbanist community in my dissertation to a standard suburban community that was right next door. And so not only was I looking at whether or not the built environment can facilitate social capital, but also whether or not there are specific features that contribute to that, and then how those features might contribute to the development of social capital. So just a little bit, and this is so brief, and there's so much more to new urbanism. I would recommend that you kind of look at some books if you want to understand new urbanism in a more detailed way. But some of the things I was looking at in the particular new urbanist development that I was studying, which is called Savano in Tucson, Arizona. So this development had porches for all the residences. There was mixed use zoning incorporated within the neighborhood. There was mixed housing, so different styles of houses, different sizes of houses, kind of trying to attract different types of people into the neighborhood. There was quality architecture. They tried to ensure that all of the housing looked similar. And then based on stuff that Jane Jacobs did, they tried to create short blocks, connected streets that would promote pedestrianism so that people would walk. So this is just an overview of the new urbanist development I was looking at. Like I said, it was called Savano. It had a mixed use area here in the center, in which all of the residences were no more than a 5 to 10 minute walk, depending on how quickly you walked, to get to these neighborhood amenities. So the idea was that people would have access to, a local market, cafe, yoga studio, things like that, that they use regularly, and so that they could walk, in a pedestrian fashion to all of these amenities. They had walking paths throughout the neighborhood. There was also a school so that the children could walk to their local school rather than having to get in a bus or something like that. And I don't know if you can tell, but you can see that just based on the sizes of the lots, that there are different types of housing. These are row houses that are more like apartments. This is kind of a bungalow style housing down here. These are sort of bigger, more traditional looking lots and bigger houses. Most of the houses had some kind of a granny flat associated with them, so they could be turned into rentals, or grandmother could come and stay with the family, things like that. So this was just the basics of the community that I was looking at for my dissertation. And this is the sample that I had. It wasn't the best, but keep in mind that both of these communities were fairly new, and they had between 200 and about 400 residents at the time. And so, it wasn't a huge sample size, but it was actually a pretty decent chunk of the people that were living there. And I did do comparisons with looking at census data, and the census data seemed to be fairly consistent to the data that I saw here. So I felt pretty comfortable that I was representing the neighborhoods well. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the data, a lot of detail about this stuff, but you can see the new urbanist community was a little bit older. Philosophically, people were a little bit more liberal. They were less likely to have kids, which was interesting. There was more older adults that lived in the new urbanist community. You could see the age was a lot older, slight difference in education, but not a huge difference there. And then also, unfortunately for this community, a lot less likely to have non-white. So only 3.4% of the residents were non-white, compared to 10% in the standard suburban subdivision. Incomes were similar. And then this is a variable that I'm going to talk about here in a minute, which was looking at the social bias factors of residents moving in. And so I asked a couple of questions. I don't have them here today, but I asked questions about sort of respondents' desire to socialize within the neighborhood. And so that was something I used as a control to see whether or not there were differences in, you know, sort of the level of interest that residents had in social interaction. And so these are the results from the sort of comparison between the new urbanist community and the standard suburban community. And you can see that the new urbanist community did have a lot more social capital. So people, they're living in the new urbanist community had one more unplanned interaction per day. They knew the names of 12 more neighbors. They had 8 more people they identified as acquaintances, 3 more friends. I believe it was 1 more close friend in the neighborhood. They had higher levels of trust for their neighbors. They routinely rated the community as stronger, and that they said they preferred living there more than people in the standard suburban community. And then this was also related strongly to like Putnam's variables on social capital, where neighbors are more likely to cooperate and work together to improve something within the neighborhood. Sometimes they would go to each other's houses. There was a community garden. There were different kinds of projects that they did throughout the neighborhood, but they were much more likely to help each other than residents in the standard suburban community. So this was all really good, you know, solid results that I got. I was really happy about this when I did my dissertation. But unfortunately, when I put in the variable for social bias, you can see that this first model is just comparing the new urbanist community to the suburb, and you can see there's much higher levels of social capital, very strongly significant. Even if I put in all the controls aside from social bias, we still see a very high level of statistical significance here for social capital. But then unfortunately, as soon as I put in the social bias control, I found that most of the differences, and you still see a difference, but it wasn't statistically significant anymore. And so that, you know, that was a little bit tricky. Sometimes the data doesn't turn out the way exactly that you want it to. I'm sure you guys will find that as you're doing dissertations and things like that. But I did kind of take away from this that it's really important to look at, you know, selection bias when you're trying to understand who's moving into what different communities. The other thing that reviewers often point out, and I think is absolutely true, is that it's very hard to understand whether or not the social bias came in with the resident or whether or not they developed that bias once they got there. So it's possible they got to the community and there was a lot of interaction and they decided, oh, this is really great, I like this. Or it's possible they were searching for interaction and they moved to that community because that community was promoting interaction. And so it's really hard to tease that out. It's kind of like the chicken and the egg. But that's definitely something that, you know, I always recommend people use this selection bias when they're doing research on communities to make sure that that's not one of the factors that explains why there's more social capital. Okay, so that's the first part of this study, and let me get into the second thing that I looked at. So the second thing I wanted to say was, okay, we have this selection bias issue, but for, you know, for the social capital we see in this community, which there was really high levels of social capital, what were the features of the built environment that could help to explain why we have higher levels of social capital? And then, like, is there a way that I can get at how the social capital is being facilitated? And so I looked at those two things, and I specifically looked at neighborhood amenities and what kinds of things people did within the neighborhood. So you can see these are all things that were available to residents in the neighborhood. And actually later on, there became more things available. I think there's a little market and stuff there now, but there was a ballet studio, a bed and breakfast, a bicycle shop, coffee shop, fitness center, a plant nursery, a little inn, a yoga studio. There's even a tavern that I didn't put on here, but a tavern where people could go and get a beer if they wanted. So these were the neighborhood amenities. I had a very simple survey question just asking whether or not you used any of these amenities, yes or no. And so skipping straight to the results, you can see that people who use the amenities had longer path lengths than people who didn't. And I'm going to explain why I chose to look at these path lengths in a minute. So I did find that there was, you know, social capital was definitely connected with this, but I wanted to understand why that was true. And so I looked at this path length, and I found that, you know, people that use these amenities had about 200 more feet in their average path length for the people that they knew within the neighborhood. If you were a member of the homeowners association, you actually had a path length that was, tie length that was about 900 feet more than people that were not in the association. And interestingly, if you were female, you also had a longer tie length. And the tie length means that you knew people that were further away from where you lived in the neighborhood. So, you know, that map that I had, I can't quickly get back there, but the map that I had, actually, let's see, here it is. So this map, so somebody with a long tie, maybe they live here and they knew somebody over here. Or maybe somebody lived here and they knew somebody this way or this way. So this was measuring how long the tie was from where the person lived. And let's go back there. And so you can see that these factors were definitely related to how long the tie was, or the average tie length for those people that took advantage of these amenities. And I'm just going to explain a little bit of why tie length is important. I think this was something that, this is actually one of the studies that I was most proud of, but I think not enough people really understood what I was talking about. So I don't feel like this study gets cited as much as some of my other ones, but I think it's, for me, it's one of the most interesting things that I found. So what you can see is that when you look at how far people's connections are from one another in terms of spatial distance, you can see that most people's connections are within 800 feet. So just really like within a block or two. If you spread out from there, you can see that there's a few more. If you get to about 1,300 feet, if you get to 1,900 feet, you get a few more. And when you get out really far to these, you know, people at very opposite ends of the neighborhood, that there's only a very few number of ties that go that much of a distance. And so you kind of get this picture that, you know, in terms of bridging and bonding ties, that the proximate ties, the ones that are just within a few blocks, act more as bonding ties, where, you know, most people in the neighborhood have these ties that are really close. They only know the people that live like a few doors down, but they don't know people at the other side of the neighborhood. And so these ties that are long distance ties end up being really important, because they're the ones that actually connect people in a way that's sort of like bridging. They connect these clusters. So you've got these clusters of short ties, and then these long distance ties act as bridges that bridge the clusters. So it's almost like what you see in Watson-Strogatz when they talk about clustering and path length. And so these bridges are the long distance ties. And so the fact that the network amenities are helping to create long distance ties shows you that the network amenities are really important to have within the neighborhood, because they're facilitating these very important ties that connect the group together, so they're not just isolated cliques within the community. And I just put in a couple, these are from Putnam and Granovetter. Bonding social capital constitutes a kind of sociological superglue, whereas bridging social capital provides a sociological WD-40. So that's where these bridging spatial ties come in. And then Granovetter says the more local bridges in a community and the greater their degree, the more cohesive the community and the more capable of acting in concert. So this just gives you an idea of how much you know, people who do social capital theory feel that bridging social ties are really important. And so for me, amenities that can create these longer distance ties within the communities are really important for creating social capital within the community. And you can actually see this in this last analysis that I did. I looked at the dependent variable of social capital, and I broke up the tie length into 3 different categories. So there's people that had the shortest tie lengths, the people with the average number of tie lengths, and then like in the middle, and then these are the ones in the top. So these are the ones with the longest tie lengths. And you can see that the only one that's statistically significant in relation to the people with the shortest tie lengths is the ones with the longest tie lengths. And they had a significantly higher level of social capital. So it suggested that, you know, being one of these people with these bridging ties actually increased your level of social capital within the community, so that you knew more people, you interacted with more people, you had more trust for neighbors, things like that. So this suggests that, you know, these long distance ties are really important for social capital within the community. Okay, so that's the first couple of studies. These are studies that are older, and now I'm going to take you into some stuff that I have been doing more recently. So this is looking at social capital within residence halls of a university that I work at. Sorry, I need a little water. So in this second study, I was looking at a couple of different research questions. The first one I wanted to know, and this kind of comes back to stuff, you know, going back to a lot of the social network research that came, you know, early on, like in the 50s and 60s, where people were really looking at network structure and trying to understand how different parts or facets of network structure could predict different outcomes. And so I wanted to understand, is it possible that network structure could be used to predict social capital? So even if I don't know if a community has high levels of social capital, if I know that there's certain network structures, can I assume that there probably is high levels of social capital? In some ways, this could be important if you're doing research where measuring social capital might be difficult, but maybe there's other kinds of information you have, so you can use the network structure to predict whether or not you've got high levels of social capital. And then another question that came out of this for me is, and it's kind of a slightly different question, but it's this idea that, you know, people have these resources in their networks which they can use to gain benefits and resources within the network. And so the question is, you know, yeah, people have resources with the network, but do they actually mobilize the resources that they have? Are they actually able to take advantages of the resources that are in the network, or are they not very good at doing that? And I actually haven't seen a lot of studies that look at that. I've seen a couple, but I thought this was a really interesting area. And so this is something I've been looking at more recently. So I'm going to start with this first question, and then I'll get into this one last. So this was the dependent variable that I looked at. And because of the fact that there's a really high correlation between the way that people usually measure social capital in terms of, you know, the number of network connections and things like that, I use psychological sense of community, which is kind of like a feeling that people have. Like, do you feel like there's a sense of community, as a proxy for social capital? So I kind of wanted to find out, did people have like this feeling that their community was connected and that they could get, you know, that they were supported by their community? And I use that as a way to kind of measure social capital, like emotional social capital, that you feel like there's social capital. So there's just questions about, you know, whether or not you feel similar to people. Do you get support from people, or is there no one that can help you when you feel like you've got some personal issues to discuss? So just kind of questions getting at whether or not you feel connected to the community, and then also whether or not you feel supported coming from the community. And this comes from actually some psychologists who are community psychologists. What is it? It's oh man, I'm forgetting their names, but I can look at, if anybody wants to know their names, let me know and I'll send you an email. Okay, and then in terms of the network structure, the independent variables I looked at for this particular study were looking at within ties. So like within your group, how many of the ties stay within your small group, and then how many go out to the wider group? What is the average degree within? So like just how many people have lots of connections going to their nodes, and how many, you know, within the group, and how many don't? Degree distribution, this is not something that's always looked at, but I found it was an important variable. And so this looks at like, is there a lot of variation in how connected people are with their degrees? Is there some people that are superstars that have all the connections and most people have very few, or is it more homogeneous where everybody has sort of a similar level of degree distribution? So I looked at that, whether or not that affects social capital. Clustering and path length are coming right out of the Watson-Strogas and other mathematical sociology stuff. So clustering just has to do with like whether or not people are likely to cluster into small groups. And then path length is how long it takes to get from one node to any other node within the group. And obviously the shorter the path length, that means that it's a more connected group. And then I looked at just levels of trust, frequency of interaction, strong ties. So this is whether or not people felt like they had a really strong connection, or whether it was more of a, kind of a weaker connection, that they didn't feel quite as connected emotionally with the people in the group. And then diversity, I looked at this. This was a tricky one to get at. This particular residence hall didn't have as much diversity as I would have liked in terms of race, but I kind of added up lots of different measures of diversity. So I looked at biological sex, I looked at age, race, SES, and GPA scores. And so I kind of measured the diversity of all of those different things. And then I created one aggregated diversity score for each of the groups. And so let me show you quickly. For the groups, I had RA groups. So all of the students within each of the residence halls had like an RA, or a resident advisor, who was the one who was in charge of the whole group. And so the resident advisor basically had 30 to 50 students that were all, they did things, they had meetings together once a month. Sometimes they did activities together. So they kind of had things that bonded them as a group. And so I looked at each of these groups individually, and out of the 322 students, I had 15 separate RA groups. So I basically compared all of these 15 groups in terms of the structure of the networks to see whether or not the ones with higher social capital had different structures than the ones with low social capital. And all this other stuff is just more demographic information about the groups. And I don't know, unfortunately in this talk, because I didn't have a ton of time to get into the specifics, but I'm using QCA, Qualitative Comparative Analysis, which was developed by Charles Reagan. If anybody's interested, I definitely recommend Googling QCA. There's a lot of information on it. It's a really interesting way of studying small groups. If regression is not really available because you have a small group size, QCA is actually a really, really wonderful method to use. And so I would recommend for anybody that's doing small groups. You can see these groups are mostly under about 30 students. And so QCA is actually perfect for this kind of analysis. And so what I did is I took the groups and I looked at sort of levels of, this is the psychological sense of community, diversity. I looked at trust, all of these different things. And I figured out what the range was, the median. And I basically kind of just, to be quick and dirty, I broke them into either 1 where you had high levels, or 0 where you had, so if you were above the median, you were in the high group. And if you were below the median, you were in the low group. And so that looked like this. And this, in QCA, this is called a CRISP table. And it's just a little bit easier to get meaningful outcomes when you do a CRISP table rather than a table that's more of the, it's called a fuzzy table this way. And so I use the CRISP table, and this was just an example of kind of how you get from the fuzzy table to the CRISP table, what these ones in red are. But don't worry about that too much right now. The main thing is what I was doing was trying to understand whether or not the psychological sense of community, which was my proxy for social capital, could be explained by these different network outcomes. And so when you do the QCA analysis, this is what comes out. So anything that's in blue has a consistency of 1.0, which means that it is 1.0 consistency means that every time you see a high level of social capital, you always have this outcome. And every time you see a low level of social capital, you always have these 3 outcomes. 100% of the time you see these, and 100% of the time you see this one. And then the ones that are 0.75, 0.86, that means that 75% of the time you have this outcome. So most of the time you see it, but not always in the outcomes. And so for social capital, we see that the outcomes that are the most critical are, there's a high average degree that, most people have a lot of connections within the group. So, if you look at the nodes, there's a lot of, either in or out degrees coming into the nodes. I just did degrees in general, not in or out. And then the ones that also were important were having a low path length, which means that the group is pretty well connected. I found this to be interesting. So groups with fewer stars, so there were fewer people that, you know, had all of the connections. They were much more evenly distributed between all of the different actors in the group. This was more likely to lead to social capital. And then unfortunately, you see this a lot, but the groups that had less diversity in terms of race, sex, age, those ones are more likely to have social capital. And again, you often see that in neighborhoods as well, which is concerning, but it's just a fact that you see. In terms of the ones that had very low levels of social capital, it's kind of the opposite. You see very few connections between group members. There's not a lot of connections directly within the group. People are not interacting as often, and you can see this is 100% of the time you see these three outcomes. And then there's less clustering and fewer strong ties. And so if I kind of look at this in what QCA calls a reduction, it gives you sort of a path to get to where you want to go depending on the variables that you have. And so to have higher levels of social capital, you need high degree and low path length and less diversity and fewer stars, which is kind of what I showed you previously. And then there's another path where if you do have some stars within the group, then you can overcome that by having more frequent interaction and also some clustering. And so it's interesting that sort of there's a way to overcome if you have a medium level of stars in the group by having these two things present as well. And then for groups that really lacked social capital, that were on the bottom level of the social capital, these three things were always present, not a lot of degree, a lot of connections, not a lot of within group connections, very little frequency in terms of interactions. And then also there was, for a lot of the groups, you saw not a lot of clustering and then not a lot of strong ties. So this was kind of, these were kind of the findings that I found. Honestly, like, I'm still trying to make sense of all this, like what's critical. I mean, the fact that the degree is an important component of social capital doesn't surprise me, but it's also not earth-shattering either. I mean, you would expect that. Some of these other things are kind of more interesting, especially how you kind of overcome having stars in the group, or that the fact that having some superstars who take up all of the connections really hurts the overall level of social capital in the group. I thought that was interesting. And so, oops. So basically the big outcomes in terms of facilitating social capital within network structure are that you want a more connected group in terms of degree, clustering, and low path length. You want a more homogeneous group, not only in terms of demographics, but also in terms of whether or not you have superstars that have a lot of connections. And then you also want group members that interact quite frequently. So this would be sort of like the recipe to create high levels of social capital within a group. And then this is sort of, you see for ones that lack social capital, they're less connected and they have less frequent interaction. Okay, and then hopefully, I know this you guys are seeing a lot, but I'm just kind of going over all the outcomes that I found to be most interesting in the last few years. So the last one I'm going to talk about is looking at mobilizing social capital. So this comes out directly out of writings from Bourdieu, and then also if you look at Lynn and Erickson and just Lynn as well, you see discussion of how it is that social capital can be facilitated in order to get, gain benefits. And so, Bourdieu talks about social capital is the aggregate of the actual or potential resources which are linked to possession of a durable network. And so that's sort of the traditional part that people always quote in their papers. But a lot of times people leave out this part, which is, this social capital enables a person to exert power on the group or individual who mobilizes the resources. So, being able to mobilize the resources in the network can help you exert power and gain benefits, right? And then Lynn says the same thing. The relations in one's social networks, that their resources may be accessed and mobilized. So again, the idea is that you've got these, you've got connections within your social network, and you've got resources within the connections, but they're really, the resources don't really matter if you can't mobilize them. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that I have a wealthy uncle who's a millionaire and I need to borrow money for my business, right? I want to start up a business. If that uncle is really somebody who's kind of, like a Scrooge, doesn't want to give, kind of miserly, doesn't want to give money, it might be hard to mobilize the resources. If I have a bad relationship with that uncle, maybe I've kind of, over the years not kept in touch, or I've angered him in some way, that may affect my ability to mobilize that resource. So, I think this is a critical thing in social capital research, because a lot of people just measure, how many people you're connected to. Maybe they measure the resources that are available in your networks, but it's also important to understand, just because I have resources, does that actually mean that I can mobilize them? And are there ways to understand like which ones I can mobilize and which ones I can't mobilize? So this is something I've just started looking at, and it's an interesting area to me, and I'm just sort of touching the tip of the iceberg. So I'm just going to share a couple of things with you guys. So this is the data set. It's 2,645 dyads. Again, it's looking at the same residence hall students that I looked at before. So I look at, relationship quality, frequency of interaction. This is actually the big thing here is the asking advice. And so this is where I check whether or not resources are being mobilized. If you're asking advice, you're basically tapping into your resources to get advice. And so you're basically gaining benefits from your social networks through the asking of advice. And that's where you're mobilizing social capital. I would actually like to do some studies where I look at some other ways of mobilizing resources, but this was kind of a very rudimentary thing I did in this study just to check whether or not this would be an interesting area of research. And so this is actually kind of the crux of what I'm trying to get at here. And so this is the average network within all of these different ego networks that I looked at. So this is what the average ego network looked like for all 322 students in the survey. So there was about 15.2 alters. So the average person had 15 people that they connected with. Some of them were, high quality alters, and some were low quality alters, but in all it was about 15.2. And then the key thing for this study is these black dots. So the black dot is a person that I have deemed to have a high level of a resource that's a high level resource. And again, this is very much kind of rudimentary, but what I did was I said, okay, people are asking, I asked whether or not you asked advice for schoolwork. And so I determined whether or not you were a high quality advice person, a high quality resource if you had a high GPA. So the idea was if you had a high GPA, you're much more likely to give a good answer if somebody was seeking advice about their homework or something than if you had a low GPA. I know that's very rudimentary, but that was sort of the best I could do on this study. But at least it gives us an idea that if you're asking about schoolwork, GPA may be a decent indicator to understand if you are a high quality resource. So the ones that are black dots are people that have high GPAs, and so they would be considered high quality resources. The dark line is the line that shows who people asked for academic related advice. And you can see that on average, there was people asked 7.2, there was 7.7 people that had high GPAs, but there were 5.5 people that were asked academic related questions. And so you can see that the dark arrows are the ones that got asked. So the ego asked these 5 people for help with homework or something of that nature, or academic help. And you can see that on average, they hit about 2.8, a little bit more than half of the time they hit somebody that was a high resource person in the network. But there were also times when they hit somebody like this arrow here that has, it's not a darkened arrow. This is a high resource person that did not get asked a question. Or the opposite, this is a low resource person that got asked an academic question, and this also was a low resource person. And so, looking at this graph, I was trying to understand whether or not people effectively mobilize the resources. And, just based on this rudimentary data, it seems that maybe they don't. Maybe people, when they're asking questions or if they're seeking out whatever resources, whatever kinds of benefits you can get, maybe it's even social support, maybe they're not going to the people that have the highest level of resources. And so again, this is a very, it's a kind of a very rudimentary study, just a quick kind of analysis, but I think it does sort of suggest that maybe people, at least in terms of academic resources, in terms of, academic advice, maybe they don't effectively mobilize the resources that they have within their networks. And if you look at sort of what are the things that people do use most often to determine where they should be asking advice in terms of academic advice, these are the three things that were the most likely outcomes. So they looked at people who were high quality, so people they considered to be really close friends. That was one of the most, the most impactful things that determined whether or not you asked somebody for, advice. If you interacted with somebody frequently, you asked them for advice more often than if you didn't. And then also this was very, very strong outcome. How close, if you lived in the same room with somebody, or if you lived on the same hall, you're much more likely to ask them for advice than if you live further away. And the thing was that these things did not necessarily correlate very strongly with how good of a resource that it was. So oftentimes people chose their how to mobilize resources based on proximity and how high the quality relationship was, rather than whether or not it was a good resource. And so I think that this this study at least suggests that this might be an area that's fruitful for further research to understand how it is that people do mobilize the resources that they have, and how they're able to kind of decide which ones they should try to mobilize and which ones they shouldn't. So that's the last one I want to talk about. And I'll just give you kind of the takeaways from each of the 4 studies that I talked about. So in the first study, the major takeaway for me was that if you're doing neighborhood comparison studies, you definitely should use some kind of selection bias measurement so that you can rule that out as a possible trigger for social capital. In terms of the second study, I feel that these long distance ties within a neighborhood really do act as bridges that help to facilitate social capital within a neighborhood. The third thing was looking at network structure. And so networks that were connected, homogeneous, and interacted more frequently were more likely to have social capital than ones that didn't have those characteristics. And then in the last one that I just presented, the evidence suggests to me that people do not effectively mobilize the resources that they have within their networks. And I know there's a lot of sort of disparate things going on there, but these are all things within social capital that really interest me. I get interested in a lot of different facets of social capital. And that's one of the things I think that's so interesting about social capital research, is that it does have a lot of different areas that are available for research. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you guys for coming out, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Joseph, so much for your interesting presentation. And also, I think it is very helpful for our group that you also gave some methodological advice. Some people will definitely need it. We had some discussion already in this chat. Perhaps one person already wants to contribute something or ask a question. Please, if you want to ask a question or have a comment, put it in the chat so that I can make somehow a list of
sorry, yeah, I wasn't looking at the chat. I probably should have looked at that as I was going through. Sorry about that.
No, it was perfect. You could have a short look now, and in the meantime, all people who want to have a question, just write it in the chat so that I know about, or send me a private message.
Okay, let me look here. Has anyone found a measure of bonding versus bridging ties? Well, in the study that I showed you, I was using distance as a measure, as sort of a way to approximate bridging versus bonding ties. There are other You know, I think Putnam tends to look at sort of weak ties as being things that are more likely to bridge. And obviously Grenovetter talks about that. And then strong ties as being more likely to bond. So if you looked at like Grenovetter, you're going to get some interesting stuff about bridging and bonding ties. And then Putnam also talks about that as well. Let's see, Stephanie Davidson. Oh yeah, okay. Or quality of ties. Okay, let's see, depends on capture. Oh, you guys were answering the questions for me. That's good. Okay, let's see, the approach often determined. Okay, good. Yeah, if you read through the comments, there's actually a lot of good answers to the questions that were asked. In terms of social capital, seeing ethnicity, education, measure bonding, bridging. Okay, yeah. So looking at ethnicity, education, and employment, similarity can also lead you to bridging and bonding. Let's see. I would question the underlying assumption of using commonality to measure bridging bonding. Okay, that's probably true. There's still not really any great way to understand complex adaptive systems and emergent patterns. Yes. Let's see. Mercy scale, hence I would urge caution. Okay, so most of those were sort of answering the question. Does anybody have any specific questions that they want to ask? I'd be happy to answer them. Any comments about the role of green space as facilitating social capital in your new urbanist development research? So I actually looked at one of the amenities I looked at was park space within this neighborhood. And unfortunately, park space, if that's what you're talking about for green space, did not really seem to facilitate social capital in the same way that some of these other amenities did. People use those spaces, but they didn't interact in them. So they would go for walks. They would maybe go with, you know, somebody that they knew already, but they weren't meeting new people there. And oftentimes they weren't interacting all that much within those spaces unless it was with, like I said, like if they went with a parent or a friend or something like that. Let's see. And when you say green space, is that what you're talking about, or were you referring to something else when you said green space? Sean, I'm reading your comment.
In the meantime,
hi, Joseph. Yeah, I'm just I'm thinking about a guy called Richard Louv, and he wrote a book called Vitamin N about nature. So green space could refer to biophilic design, which may talk about trees and shrubbery within buildings or outside of buildings, but it also could refer to you know, lawns and trees and, you know, bushes outside of buildings, and you know, anywhere you see the color green, it's just related to nature. So just really variations on nature.
Interesting. You know, I think it sounds interesting. I've seen researchers, community researchers talk about that, but I actually don't know a lot of the research. But it does seem, I've seen actually some research where they look at nature in terms of within spaces, like within buildings and things like that, and that it does seem to facilitate interactions in some way. Just people feel a little bit more relaxed in those kinds of circumstances, but I haven't seen anything like at the community level. Let's see. Interested in the importance of individual social responsibility for the development of social capital of the local community. Have done some research on the local level, very local level, but I'm interested in the development of local communities. Do you maybe have some research that you've done about that? So for me, I mean, when I was looking at local communities, it definitely seemed like at the node level, at the individual level, it was the people who were able to create bridging ties, you know, the ones who were able to get out of their clusters and meet people that lived in other parts of the neighborhood, or meet people that were ethnically different than them, or meet people that were, you know, had a different SES standing, or their economic standing was different. So the people that were able to kind of like come out of their local cluster and become more of a bridge, those are the ones that were able to foster social capital within the community much more than people that didn't do that. So, and actually the ones in my community that created the most bridging ties were the people that were in the homeowners association, because there was like a small group that there was a council that was, I think, 15 members of the community. And those people knew a lot of people within the community, and they bridged a lot of different groups. And so they were actually critical in creating social capital within this network. And so, having that homeowners association seemed to be like a really critical link in creating bridging connections. What do you think is the stars effect? Some of you are deliberately clustering stars and wondering if it's a good idea. Yeah, I mean, I found the stars effect to be pretty interesting, that it was a prominent outcome in, the groups that had higher levels of social capital did not have one or two superstars that were like really popular that knew everybody. It was more like they had a lot of average people that kind of knew an average number of people. And so the groups that had like one or two superstars that knew everybody, it seemed like they were the hubs and everybody kind of interacted through them, but they didn't interact with each other as much. And so in a way, it seemed like having stars in your network seemed to hamper social capital for the whole group. And so, I don't know how that would, like if you went to a larger community, I don't know how that would work, but within these small groups, it seemed like stars were a negative in terms of social capital. But I think that's actually a really interesting area, and I'd love to see people doing more work on that kind of, looking at the disparity of social connections. Let's see here. And, I do have some, if anybody's interested in anything in particular, email me and I can send you guys some links to some of the, if I go through my resources. But yeah, if you're interested, email me and I'd be happy to send you any kinds of references that I have for work that I talked about today. I've got, unfortunately, some of this work was done a while ago, so I don't have it right in my mind, all of the researchers, but email me and I'd be happy to share. What do you think? Okay, does anyone look into mobile phones being tools? I know there's actually a guy at UCLA, Omar Lizardo, who has looked at mobilizing, like using mobile phones to understand social capital. And in terms of, okay, so I'm actually curious about it. When you say using mobile phones to mobilize social capital, can you explain what you mean by that? This is Marwa.
Hi, yes. Basically, just as a tool to reach out to the social network that is not within proximity through mobiles. And I'm looking specifically about the refugees.
Oh, okay. And so like what kinds of resources would you be mobilizing through the mobile phone?
They're trying to probably Lebanon, for example, finding a spouse, a potential spouse, or finding an opportunity to let's say if their network in the Netherlands tells them that it seems that the state has been kinder with the refugees, the migrant refugees, then they would start their documents, trying like even as a potential way out. Even maybe these days it's a lot harder, but around 2014, 2013 was a possibility, a bigger possibility. So they actually, in my research, I noticed that they did capitalize on their international social network so that they can escape their reality in a country that is more of a non-permanent host to refugees.
Interesting. That's actually really fascinating. And the idea that a mobile phone can give you access to resources that are very far away from your local social networks, I think is very fascinating. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the ones who were able to mobilize their cell phones to get you were talking about maybe finding support internationally to help you get out of that situation. That might be a very useful thing. In terms of relationships, I think that's also fascinating, where the nature of the way people meet, if more people are meeting online, it suggests that those online connections are actually creating sort of bridges that maybe didn't exist before, where if most people used to meet significant others in a more local way, then maybe the mobile phone is creating more sort of long distance bridging types of connections that maybe didn't exist. I think that's actually kind of fascinating. But
Yeah.
no, I actually have not seen anybody do that, but I think that would be a really interesting study for somebody to do for sure. Are you in Lebanon?
Yes.
You are, okay.
One of the important parts about this is because they have a common trauma that they are helping each other in any way they can, and they're reaching out to far social networks that they have proves to be a little bit easier because of the shared suffering. So that was very interesting. I mean, when you speak about a neighborhood and being able to bridge a tie between someone living at the very end of a community versus, you know, very, very far away geographically, when it's a refugee situation, it doesn't even have to be geographically close at all. They can still find reasons to help each other, and that's I think is very, very fascinating, very beautiful.
I think that's interesting. That's really, I actually, at my university, it's very interesting. There's 2 or 3 Lebanese that are pretty high levels within the administration. And so we actually have a much higher proportion of Lebanese employees than you would expect at a small university, because I think those social connections, you know, they've been, people reach out from different places, and then we end up getting a much higher number of applicants that are Lebanese than you would at like other universities. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, and something I think somebody should look into that, understanding how mobile phones mobilize resources. Let's see.
That has been my research. Almost done with it, but
well,
yeah.
I will look forward to seeing when you start publishing that research.
Thank you.
So let me see if there's a couple more questions here before we run out of time. So I'll put Joseph, yeah, definitely give out my contact information. Let's see. Oh, here's a built environment recommended reading, Foster Sheila. That's a good one. Studying the links between democratic governance and social capital. I've learned that people expect the leader to have political affiliation so the person can bring more benefits to the community. Interesting. However, as you mentioned in your presentation, it's important to see how people are able to utilize the resources of the leader, from the leader. Good. I have a problem for internet connection. Okay. Thanks for attending. Okay. Okay, good. Does anybody have any last questions?
Joseph, I thought I might ask you about how you're dealing with the mobilization issue, because I think it's it's a really important one, that social capital is so often seen as a potentiality rather than, an actual resource. And so, we know that networks aren't necessarily social capital, because you can know a bunch of people, but if the norms and the trust and so forth aren't very positive, then you don't really have any social capital. And I think it's also difficult as well, because even if people don't ask for help or don't seek help or don't actually get resources mobilized through their network, they may still have a lot of social capital, because it's just simply hasn't been actualized. The potentiality exists, but it hasn't actually been actualized. So I think it becomes a really difficult issue for operationalization of social capital, because how do you go about measuring that potentiality when you can't really just look at the existence of a network? You can't really just look at what is actually being mobilized within the network or within the community. And so I think there is really a question there of, well, how do you really get to that potentiality? And it's great that you're addressing it, but I think it still remains a bit of a challenge as to how to do that effectively.
Yeah, and I agree with you. There's a long ways for me to go on that research. And I like the idea of, the potentiality of the resources that you can access. And I think understanding things like trust and the quality of the relationships and the frequency of interaction, that really kind of helps you to understand whether or not you're able to mobilize those resources, or whether or not you have the potential to mobilize them. So yeah, I think that's really fascinating, and it does give a different level to how you measure social capital. Yeah, definitely. Have you done any research on that? Is there stuff I should
No, I haven't.
No, okay.
I've been exploring it theoretically, and I tend to focus more on the qualitative approach, where you're basically looking at, because there's trust and because there's norms, therefore that is basically the potentiality. What actually is happening within the community is kind of secondary to that, and so looking at more of the sort of cognitive aspects of social capital that create that potentiality.
Interesting. Yeah, I think a qualitative study would actually be probably a good way to get at some of those understandings of how those resources are mobilized within the network. Yeah, that's interesting. All right, thanks, Tristan. And anybody else?
I think we are done from the chat, and we are also out of time. But we had a very interesting presentation. I think a lot of people wrote it already, and I found it fascinating, especially the thing about the mobilization of resources. It's clear, but I would have never thought about it without you. And you also, as I said already, I think for a lot of people, your research might be helpful in our group, because you have good methodologies and also good results. So thank you so much for your presentation. I think we started with 25 members and now we are still 22. So you got all people interested.
Well, thank you for having me. And I would encourage anybody who has questions, feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
And as I wrote, I will put your contact data in the group if you agree. And yes, we will stay in touch. I think Tristan has this big site, socialcapitalresearch.com, and he has a regular or semi-regular newsletter. We will also send you his contact data, and
yeah, definitely. You could you can put my contact information and send me any information you have about upcoming webinars. I'd love to be participate in the webinars. Okay,
nice. Good. Right. Then thank you all so much for attending. For the ones who are attending in the middle of the night, sleep well. For the other ones, have a successful day.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.